There is a particular kind of theft that does not announce itself as theft. It does not come in the night with tools and masks. It does not leave broken locks or scattered belongings or the obvious evidence of violation that makes the wrongness immediately clear to anyone who looks. It comes in daylight, with surveying equipment and official-looking documents, and the quiet administrative confidence of people who have decided that the difference between what is theirs and what is yours is a matter of interpretation rather than law. It comes dressed as a boundary adjustment, a minor correction, a small discrepancy that needs to be resolved in the interest of accuracy. It comes as 10 feet. My name is Owen Pritchard. I am 56 years old and I have owned the farm property on Caldwell Ridge for 14 years. I use the word farm deliberately and precisely. It is not a hobby farm. It is not a gentleman's retreat with a few decorative animals. It is a working property of 68 acres that my wife Laura and I have operated as a small-scale beef cattle operation since the year we bought it, with a herd that has grown from 12 animals to 41. A hay operation that produces enough to winter the cattle with surplus to sell. A vegetable garden that feeds us through the summer and half the winter. And an infrastructure of fencing and water systems and outbuildings that represents 14 years of physical labor and considered investment. Property sits at the eastern boundary of a residential development called Caldwell Ridge Estates, which was built 8 years after I purchased my land, and which occupies what was formerly an adjacent farm that had been sold and subdivided. The development has 42 homes on lots ranging from half an acre to 2 acres, built in the style that developers favor when they want to sell the idea of rural living without the actual inconvenience of it. Large windows facing west toward the mountains. Stone accents, wraparound porches, the aesthetic of farming without its smell, its noise, or its hours. My property sits to the east of the development. My western fence line is the boundary between my land and the eastern edge of the development. For 6 years after the development was built, that boundary was clear, established, marked by a fence I had installed in my 3rd year of ownership and confirmed by the survey I had commissioned at purchase. 6 years of no friction, no dispute, no question about where my land ended and the development began. Then the Caldwell Ridge Estates HOA hired a new management company. The management company was called Pinnacle Property Services, and they arrived on Caldwell Ridge with the energy of an organization that had identified inefficiencies in the previous management and intended to correct them. They sent a letter to all Caldwell Ridge Estates homeowners introducing themselves and outlining their commitment to community standards, property value protection, and critically, boundary maintenance. The boundary maintenance language was what I should have focused on when I first saw it. I did not. I was not a homeowner in the development. I received no letter. I was a neighboring landowner, and the HOA's management transition was not something that had any obvious relevance to my situation. I found out it was relevant 6 months after Pinnacle arrived, when 2 men I did not recognize appeared at my western fence line with surveying equipment and began working along the boundary. I drove my truck down to the fence line and got out and asked what they were doing. One of them said they were conducting a boundary survey for the Caldwell Ridge Estates HOA. I said the boundary was established and I had survey documentation. He said they were doing a routine verification. He was polite and professional and gave me no reason to be immediately alarmed. I went back to the barn and called my neighbor 2 properties to the north, a man named Dale Sturgis, who had been farming on Caldwell Ridge for 30 years and who had watched the development go in and had opinions about it. I told him about the surveyors. Dale said, "Owen, when an HOA sends surveyors to a boundary without notifying the neighboring landowner, they have decided something about that boundary already. The survey is to support the decision, not make it." I said, "What do you mean?" He said they wouldn't be out there if they weren't planning to move something. I said they can't move my fence line. The survey is recorded. He said, "Get your documents out and look at them tonight. Look at the original plat from before the development. Look at the meets and bounds description in your deed. Make sure you know exactly what you have." I pulled my documents that evening, the original survey from my purchase, the recorded plat, the deed with the legal description. I spread them on the kitchen table and Laura and I looked at them together. The western boundary of my property was clearly described. A specific bearing and distance, confirmed by physical survey markers that I had walked to when I first purchased the property and had verified twice since in the normal course of fencing and land management. 3 weeks after the surveyors appeared, I received a letter from Pinnacle Property Services. Letter informed me that a boundary survey conducted by their licensed surveyor had identified a discrepancy between my existing fence line and the recorded boundary between my property and the Caldwell Ridge Estate's common area. The letter said that my fence line was located approximately 10 feet east of the recorded boundary, meaning that 10 feet of land I had been using and fencing as part of my property was in fact, according to their survey, part of the Caldwell Ridge Estate's common area. They wanted me to move my fence 10 feet east. 10 feet for the full length of my western boundary, which ran approximately 800 feet from the northern corner of my property to the southern corner. 10 feet by 800 feet, 8,000 square feet, nearly a fifth of an acre. 14 years of fencing, cattle management, hay production, and land use, predicated on a boundary that was now being told to me was wrong. The letter was signed by Cynthia Park, the Pinnacle Property Services Regional Manager. It gave me 60 days to relocate the fence. I called Dale. He said, "I told you." I said, "Dale, my survey markers are where they have always been." He said, "Have you walked them recently?" I said, "Not in 3 years." He said, "Go walk them tomorrow, all of them, front to back on the western line. Look at every marker." I walked them the next morning. The northern corner marker was exactly where it had always been. I found it under 2 inches of accumulated vegetation, a metal pin in concrete exactly at the recorded coordinates I had noted from my purchase survey. The southern corner marker was also where it had always been. But between them, at 4 intermediate points where markers had been placed when the boundary was originally established, 3 of the 4 markers were gone, not buried, not overgrown, gone. In 2 cases, there were small disturbances in the soil that were consistent with something having been extracted. In 1 case, the soil had been turned and repacked in a way that looked deliberate. Someone had removed my survey markers. I called a licensed land surveyor that afternoon, not Pinnacle's surveyor, mine, a woman named Catherine Morse, who had been doing survey work in the county for 22 years and who had the specific credibility of a professional who had never once been credibly challenged on her measurements in 2 decades of work. I told her what I had found. I told her about the letter. I told her about the missing markers. She came on a Thursday with her equipment and an assistant, and she worked the western boundary line for 5 hours. She used the remaining corner markers, the recorded coordinates from the original survey, and the county plat records to re-establish the line with precision. She found my fence was in the right place. Her survey confirmed the boundary exactly as described in my deed and the original recorded plat. My fence sat within inches of the correct line at every point she measured. The discrepancy Pinnacle was claiming did not exist. What Pinnacle's survey had done, Catherine explained to me afterward with the careful neutrality of a professional who was describing a finding rather than making an accusation, was establish a line that deviated from the recorded plat by the consistent 10 feet Pinnacle had cited, running their measurement from a reference point that did not match the county recorded coordinates. She said, "In my professional opinion, based on the original plat coordinates and the surviving corner markers, your fence is on the correct boundary." I said, "And the intermediate markers that are missing?" She said, "I can't tell you what happened to them. I can tell you that my survey re-establishes the line without them, using the corner markers and the recorded plat, and that the line I re-established is consistent with your fence." I said, "Could someone have removed them deliberately?" She said, "That is not a determination I can make. What I can say is that the disturbance patterns you described are consistent with extraction rather than natural degradation." I said, "Catherine, is this the first time you have seen something like this?" She was quiet for a moment. She said, "In 22 years, No, it is not the first time. She prepared her formal report. I had it in hand 5 days later. I called my attorney. My attorney was a man named Robert Calloway who practiced property law in the county seat and who had handled a boundary dispute for Dale Sturgis 7 years earlier in a case that Dale had described to me as the most thorough and effective legal representation he had ever witnessed. Robert listened to the full situation. He read Catherine's report. He read Pinnacle's letter. He looked at the photographs I had taken of the disturbance patterns at the missing marker locations. He said, "Owen, I want to be precise about what you have here." I said, "Tell me." He said, "You have a recorded plat, a deed with a legal description, and a license survey confirming that your fence is on the correct boundary. You have a management company claiming a discrepancy that a second independent survey does not support. You have missing survey markers at intermediate points whose absence benefits the party making the claim. And you have photographic documentation of disturbance patterns consistent with extraction." He said the boundary dispute itself is straightforward to resolve. Catherine's survey, submitted to the county with a quiet title action, will confirm your boundary legally and permanently. I said, "What about the markers?" He said the removal of survey markers is a criminal act in this state, a Class C felony if it can be proven deliberate. The documentation you have is suggestive but not conclusive. What I recommend is filing both the quiet title action and a formal complaint with the county sheriff regarding the missing markers. I said, "You think I can prove it?" He said, "I think the combination of the timing, the pattern of removal specifically targeting intermediate markers while leaving corner markers that are harder to use for re-establishment, and Pinnacle's survey using a reference point that happens to produce exactly the 10-foot deviation they are claiming, creates a circumstantial picture that a law enforcement investigation may find productive." He said, "File both." I said, "Robert, even if I win the quiet title action and the boundary is legally confirmed, Pinnacle is still going to be the HOA management company next door. The homeowners in the development are still going to be looking at my farm across a fence line they were apparently told was 10 feet closer to them." He said, "What are you thinking?" I said, "I am thinking about what comes after the legal resolution." He said, "Tell me." I said, "My farm is 68 acres. The western 10 feet of my property, the strip they were trying to take, runs along the full 800 feet of my western boundary. That strip is mine. I can use it for whatever legal agricultural purpose I choose." Robert looked at me. He said, "Owen, what are you planning?" I said, "When I bought this property, I had always intended to build a proper equipment barn, somewhere to house the tractor and the implements and the hay equipment out of the weather. I have been putting it off for years because of the cost and the timing." He said, "And now?" I said, "I want to know the setback requirements for agricultural structures in this county, the specific rules regarding the placement of farm buildings relative to property boundaries, and whether there is any HOA authority that applies to a neighboring agricultural property." Robert opened his laptop. He typed for 2 minutes. He said, "Agricultural structures on agricultural zone land in this county require a 15-foot setback from the property line when adjacent to residential development. There is no HOA authority over neighboring properties that are not part of the association. Agricultural zoning is a county matter entirely." I said, 15 feet. He said, 15 feet from the boundary. I said, "And the barn itself, size restrictions?" He said, "Agricultural buildings on agriculturally zoned land have no maximum size restriction in this county. They require a building permit, but the permit is based on structural specifications, not on size." I said, "No maximum size?" He said, "For an agricultural structure on agricultural land, no." I said, "Robert, what is the standard size of a large equipment barn?" He looked at me for a long time. He said, "That is not a question for a property attorney." I said, "No, but I wanted you to understand the direction I am going." He said, "Win the quiet title action first." I said, "How long?" He said 3 to 4 months for the full process. The complaint to the sheriff will run parallel. I said, then I'll wait 4 months before I call the barn contractor. He nodded slowly. He said, Owen, the barn is legal. I said, I know. He said, it is going to be very visible from the development. I said, that is an agricultural inevitability. He said, yes it is. He filed the quiet title action the following week. The complaint to the sheriff went in at the same time. The 4-month clock started. I spent those 4 months thinking about barn design. Laura was involved in the barn planning from the first conversation. She is not by nature a vindictive person, and when I brought the situation to her in full, she listened carefully and then said, Owen, what do you actually need from a barn? I said I need to house the tractor, the hay equipment, the baler, the mower, the disc, the sprayer, and the ATV. I need covered hay storage for at least 200 tons. I need a workshop space for equipment maintenance. And I need enough additional space to expand the operation if we choose to. She said, and what size barn accomplishes all of that? I said, a serious barn, a proper farm equipment barn. She said, how big is a proper farm equipment barn? I said, Dale's is 80 feet by 120 feet. His operation is smaller than ours. She looked at me, she said, you're thinking bigger. I said, I'm thinking appropriate to our actual and intended operation. She said, Owen, what size barn are you planning? I said, I want to talk to a contractor about a structure that is 100 feet wide and 200 feet long, 2 stories at the hay storage end, metal roof, painted in the traditional barn red that is standard for agricultural structures in this region. Laura was quiet for a moment. She said, that is a very large barn. I said, it is a barn appropriate to a 68-acre beef and hay operation with expansion plans. She said, and it would be placed. I said, 15 feet from the western boundary, setback compliant, running the full 200-foot length along the boundary. She said, Laura. I said, yes. She said, our western boundary is 800 feet long. I said, yes. She said, a 200-foot barn at the boundary would block the view from roughly a quarter of the development's eastern-facing homes. I said, the western end of our property is where the best equipment access is. The terrain is appropriate there. The drainage is correct. It is the sensible location for an equipment barn from a pure agricultural functionality standpoint. She looked at me for a long time with the expression she has when she is deciding whether something is a good idea or simply a satisfying one. Then she said, is it actually the sensible location? I said, Laura, we need the barn near the western gate because that is where the fields are that we hay. The hay has to go from the field into the barn. The equipment has to go from the barn to the fields. Placing the barn on the eastern side of the property adds unnecessary transit distance. She said, that is a genuine agricultural reason. I said, yes. She said, and the fact that it also blocks the view from Caldwell Ridge Estates. I said, is an agricultural inevitability. She smiled, not a big smile, a small one, the kind that means she has made her decision. She said, get the permit. The quiet title action was resolved in 3 months and 2 weeks. Robert had filed a strong submission, Catherine's survey report was thorough and professionally unimpeachable, and the recorded plat evidence left no viable counter-argument available to Pinnacle. Their attorney, a man who specialized in HOA law and who Robert told me afterward had seemed embarrassed by the position he was asked to argue, had made a motion to extend the proceedings that was denied, and had then made arguments that Judge Patricia Holden, who handled property matters in the county, had addressed with the efficient brevity of someone who considered the case straightforwardly decided. The judgment confirmed my boundary exactly as described in my deed and the original recorded plat. The fence line was legally established as correct. The 10-feet Pinnacle had claimed belonged to the Caldwell Ridge Estates common area did not. They were mine, had always been mine, and the county record now said so with the specific permanence of a judicial determination. Robert called me when the judgment was entered. He said, "Owen, it's done." I said, "Clean." He said, "Complete. The boundary is confirmed. Your survey markers are ordered reinstated at Pinnacle's expense," which was a point I argued specifically and the judge included in the order. Catherine will be doing the reinstallation and the HOA management company will be paying her bill. I said, "That is satisfying." He said, "There is one more thing, the sheriff's investigation." The sheriff's investigation had proceeded in parallel over the same 3 months. A detective named Sergeant Ben Holloway had been assigned to the criminal complaint regarding the missing markers. He had interviewed me, reviewed my photographs, consulted with Catherine, and reviewed the timing of events relative to Pinnacle's arrival and survey activities. He had also, I learned from Robert, interviewed the surveyor Pinnacle had used, a man who had apparently been cooperative with the investigation in ways that suggested he was not comfortable with the position he found himself in. Robert said, "The district attorney has declined to file criminal charges against any individual, citing insufficient direct evidence of deliberate removal." However, Sergeant Holloway's investigation did produce a finding that the markers were most likely removed during the period between Pinnacle's arrival and their survey, and that the removal was inconsistent with natural degradation. I said, "No charges." He said, "No criminal charges, but the finding is a public record, and the reinstatement order I got in the quiet title action was based partly on the judge's awareness of the investigation findings." She made a comment in her ruling that I thought was notable. I said, "Tell me." He said, she said, and this is a paraphrase, that boundary disputes in which markers are found missing in ways that benefit one party and disadvantage another are matters that courts view with particular attention, and that the full weight of the recorded plat and the independent survey left no doubt as to the correct boundary. I said she understood what happened. He said, without needing to say it explicitly. I said, "Robert, how much did Pinnacle's failed claim cost them?" He said, "Their legal fees, Catherine's reinstallation bill, and the court costs, approximately $22,000 based on my estimate." I said, "And the homeowners in the development are paying for that through their HOA dues?" He said, "Presumably yes." I said, 42 households paying for a boundary claim their management company initiated and lost." He said, "That is generally how HOA management failures distribute their costs." I said, "Good, call the building contractor." He said, "That is not my department." I said, "I know, I'll make that call myself." The contractor was a man named Pete Stahl, who built agricultural structures throughout the region, and who had come recommended by Dale as the most reliable and most experienced barn builder within 100 miles. Pete had built Dale's 80 by 120-foot structure 7 years before, and Dale said it had not required a single significant repair in 7 years of hard use. I called Pete and described what I needed. 100 feet wide, 200 feet long, 2-story at the north end for hay storage capacity, single-story at the south end for equipment housing, metal roof, engineered concrete foundation, appropriate to the soil conditions and the structure size, and the exterior finish in traditional agricultural red with white trim. Pete was quiet for a moment after I described it. Then he said, "That is a serious structure." I said, "I have a serious operation." He said, "What's the placement?" I described the western boundary location, 15 feet from the property line, running 200 feet north to south along the boundary, which put the full length of the barn facing east toward Coldwell Ridge Estates at a distance of approximately 60 feet from the nearest development lots at the closest point. Pete said, "The development is right there." I said, "Yes." He said, "The barn is going to be very visible from those properties." I said, "That is an agricultural inevitability." He said it the way people say something when they are repeating a phrase back to you and indicating they understand it carries more weight than its surface meaning. He said, agricultural inevitability. I said, Pete, do I need a barn in that location for the operational reasons I described? He said, where are your fields? I described the layout of my property, the western fields where the hay operation was concentrated, the gate access from the county road, the drainage patterns that made the western end the appropriate location for a large structure. He was quiet again, longer this time. Then he said, from a pure agricultural functionality standpoint, the western location makes sense. The hay doesn't have to travel across the property. The equipment is where the work is. I said, that is my assessment also. He said, I'll come out Saturday and look at the site. He came Saturday. He walked the western boundary with me. He looked at the terrain, the drainage, the soil, the existing fence, the development across it. He looked at the view from the development side, the long western mountain vista that I knew was the primary selling point of the Caldwell Ridge Estates lots on that side. He said, 200-foot barn is going to take most of that view. I said, yes. He said, you understand what you're doing. I said, I am building a barn for my farm operation in the legally compliant location that makes the most agricultural sense. He said, Owen. I said, Peter. He said, I'm going to need 6 weeks for materials lead time and another 12 weeks for construction. Total 18 weeks from permit approval. I said, when can you file the permit? He said, give me 2 weeks to draw the engineering. I said, file it the day the drawings are ready. He said, it's a legal structure. I said, I know. He said, on agricultural zone land. I said, I know. He said, adjacent to a residential development that tried to take 10 feet of your property. I said, that detail is not part of the permit application. He said, no, it isn't. He drove away. I stood at the western boundary and looked across at the eastern-facing homes of Caldwell Ridge Estates, their large windows catching the afternoon light, their wraparound porches facing the mountain view that had sold those lots at a premium that I knew because Dale had told me the development's marketing materials had specifically featured the western mountain vista as the primary lifestyle amenity. I looked at the 60 feet of air between my fence and their porches. I thought about 8,000 square feet of land they had tried to take. I went back to the barn and checked the cattle. The permit was filed 3 weeks after Pete's site visit. It was a standard agricultural building permit application, complete with engineering drawings, soil assessments, drainage plans, and all required documentation. The county building department processed agricultural permits on a 4 to 6 week timeline. Pete had told me to expect 5 weeks. It took 4 weeks and 3 days. During those 4 weeks and 3 days, 2 things happened that I had not anticipated. The first was a visit from Cynthia Park. Cynthia Park, the Pinnacle Property Services regional manager who had signed the letter demanding I move my fence, appeared at my farm gate on a Tuesday morning. She was in a company vehicle with the Pinnacle logo, and she had the expression of someone who had been sent to do something unpleasant and was managing it professionally. I met her at the gate. I did not invite her onto the property. She said, Mr. Pritchard, I wanted to come personally to address the situation following the court's ruling. I said, the situation has been addressed by the court. She said, yes, we accept the court's finding. I wanted to communicate that Pinnacle takes full responsibility for the boundary claim and the survey discrepancy, and that we are committed to moving forward constructively as neighbors. I said, I appreciate that. She said, we have also reviewed our internal processes and have made changes to ensure that boundary claims of this nature are handled with greater care in the future. I said, that is good to hear. She said, I understand you have filed a permit application for an agricultural structure on the western portion of your property. I said, I have. She said, I wanted to discuss whether there was any flexibility regarding the placement of the structure. I said, the placement is determined by agricultural operational requirements. She said the eastern-facing homeowners in the development have expressed significant concern about the potential impact on their western views. I said, I understand that. Farm structures on agricultural land are a known feature of the rural landscape. She said the view from those properties is a significant component of their property value. I said, I understand that as well. She said, is there anything the HOA could offer that would lead you to consider an alternative placement? I said, Cynthia, the HOA attempted to take 10 feet of my land through a boundary claim that was based on a survey using incorrect reference points, conducted after my legally established survey markers had gone missing in ways a law enforcement investigation found suspicious. The court ruled in my favor. I am now building a barn in the location that makes the most sense for my farm operation. That is where the barn is going. She said, I understand. I said, I want to be clear about something. I am not building the barn to damage the development's views. I am building it because my farm operation requires it and the location is appropriate. If the barn happens to affect the view, that is what happens when agricultural land is farmed actively adjacent to residential development. She said, of course. She left. The second thing that happened was a letter from a homeowner in the development, not through the HOA, directly, a physical letter hand-delivered to my gate. The homeowner's name was James Whitmore, and he lived in Lot 17, which was one of the lots with direct eastern exposure toward my western boundary. The letter was not hostile. It was actually, given the circumstances, a remarkably decent piece of correspondence. James Whitmore wrote that he had learned about the boundary dispute and the court's ruling, and that he thought the HOA management company had handled the situation incorrectly and embarrassingly. He said he had voted against the initial boundary claim at the homeowner meeting where it had been presented, but had been in the minority. He said he understood if I was going ahead with the barn, and he was not writing to try to stop it. He said he was writing because he thought I should know that not everyone in the development supported what Pinnacle had done, and that he personally was sorry for what had happened to my property. He included his phone number. I read the letter twice. I put it in my documentation folder. I called Robert and told him about it. He said it was legally irrelevant but humanly significant and that it was worth acknowledging. I wrote back to James Whitmore. I thanked him for the letter. I said I appreciated knowing the context of the development's internal decision-making. I said the barn was going ahead for operational reasons, but that I wanted him to know the dispute had not been with the homeowners and that I hoped we could be reasonable neighbors going forward. He replied 2 days later. He said he hoped so too. The permit was approved. Pete mobilized his crew the week after approval. They broke ground on the foundation on a Monday morning in early spring. The first concrete was poured on Wednesday, the footings cured through the weekend. I want to describe the construction in some detail because the barn that was built over those 12 weeks was not just a response to a boundary dispute. It was a structure I had actually needed for 14 years and had put off for reasons of cost and timing that had never quite aligned until now. It was a proper barn. It was, in Pete's assessment, one of the better agricultural structures he had built in 20 years of practice, because I had not compromised on specifications and had given him the budget to do it correctly. The foundation was engineered concrete, exactly specified to the soil conditions Pete's assessment had identified. The steel framing went up in the third week, prefabricated sections assembled by Pete's crew with the speed and precision of people who had done this many times. The roofing was standing seam metal in a dark charcoal gray that contrasted with the red exterior walls. The walls went up section by section through weeks 4 and 5. By the end of the 5th week, the barn had risen to its full height, 2 stories at the North Hay storage end, where the roof peak was 38 feet above grade, dropping to a single story with a 22-foot peak at the south equipment end. The steel skeleton stood against the sky in a way that was visible from a significant distance in every direction, and from the eastern-facing lots of Caldwell Ridge estates, It dominated the view in the way that large structures on flat ground tend to dominate views. Dale came over in the 5th week and stood at the fence line looking at the framing. He said, "Owen, that is a barn." I said, "Yes, it is." He said, "That is a big barn." I said, "It is appropriately sized for the operation." He said, "The development." I said, "Can see it." He said, "From every house on the eastern side." I said, "Agricultural inevitability." He said, "You've been saying that a lot." I said, "It remains accurate." He said, "What are you going to put in it?" I said, "Tractor, baler, mower, disc, sprayer, ATV, 200 tons of hay capacity at the north end, workshop at the south end, and space for the additional equipment we'll need when we expand the herd to 60. He said, "You're expanding to 60. I said, "I have been thinking about it for 3 years. The barn makes it practical." He said, "You were going to expand anyway." I said, "Eventually." He said, "The barn makes it practical now." I said, "Yes." He said, "So the barn serves the expansion." I said, "And the expansion justifies the barn." He said, "Owen." I said, "Dale." He looked at the framing. He said, "You really are going to 60 head." I said, "Laura and I have been discussing it for months. The boundary dispute and the legal resolution freed up capital I had been holding in reserve for legal fees that I would rather deploy in the herd." He said, "What capital?" I said, "The $22,000 in costs Pinnacle paid pursuant to the judgment. Court-ordered reimbursement of my legal expenses." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "They paid your legal fees." I said, "Robert argued for full reimbursement given the nature of the claim and the investigation findings." The judge agreed. He said, "They paid for the legal action that confirmed your boundary and ordered their survey markers reinstalled at their expense." I said, "Yes." He said, "And the reimbursement is funding the herd expansion." I said, "Partially." He looked at the barn framing one more time. He said, "Owen, I have been farming on Caldwell Ridge for 30 years. That is the most complete piece of justice I have witnessed in 30 years." I said, "The barn is also genuinely useful." He said, "I know, that's what makes it complete." The exterior painting happened in week 10. Pete's crew worked 2 days on the western and southern faces that were most visible from the development, and the barn red that went on the steel panels was the specific color I had specified, a traditional deep agricultural red that had been standard for farm structures in this region for 100 years, and that looked, against the spring sky, exactly like what it was. A barn, a big one, on a farm. Laura came out on the second afternoon of painting and stood next to me and looked at it. The western face of the barn was 200 feet long. At the closest point to the development boundary, it was 15 feet from my fence line and approximately 75 feet from the nearest development lot. It rose 22 feet at the equipment end and 38 feet at the hay storage end. It was, from the perspective of anyone looking west from Caldwell Ridge Estates, the primary feature of the horizon. Laura said, "It is a beautiful barn." I said, "It is." She said, "We needed it." I said, "We did." She said, "The western vista from the development," I said, "is now primarily agricultural." She said, "As it would be if they were adjacent to a working farm." I said, "Which they are." She said, "As they knew when they bought in a development adjacent to agricultural land." I said, "That information was presumably available to them." She said, "Owen." I said, "Laura." She took my arm. We stood at the boundary of our property and looked at our barn in the late afternoon light, the red walls bright against the sky, the metal roof catching the sun, the whole structure solid and necessary and exactly where it was supposed to be. Across the fence, in the nearest Caldwell Ridge Estates lot, I could see someone standing on their east-facing porch looking at the barn. I did not know who it was. I raised my hand in a brief wave. The figure waved back. James Whitmore called me in July 2 months after the barn was completed. He said he wanted to thank me for writing back, and he hoped things were going well on the farm. I said things were going well. I told him about the herd expansion, which was proceeding with the first additional cattle having arrived in June. He asked about the operation in the interested way of someone who had moved to the rural area because they found farming genuinely interesting even if they had no experience with it. We talked for 20 minutes. He asked if I ever did farm tour or had visitors. I said I had occasionally had people from the Agricultural Extension Office out and that I was open to neighbors who were genuinely curious. He said he would like to see the barn sometime. I said, come out on a Saturday morning. Laura makes coffee and we do a walk around before the day's work starts. He came the following Saturday. He was a man in his mid-40s who had moved to Caldwell Ridge Estates from the city 3 years ago with his wife and 2 children, and who had clearly found the rural adjacency to be more interesting than he had anticipated. He looked at the cattle, at the hay operation, at the equipment in the barn. He asked good questions. Laura made coffee, and we stood in the equipment end of the barn and talked about farming. At one point, he looked up at the barn interior, the full height of the hay storage end visible from where we stood, and said, "This is a remarkable structure." I said, "It is functional above all things." He said, "It blocked my western view." I said, "Yes." He said, "I was upset about that for 2 weeks." I said, "I understand." He said, "Then I thought about what the HOA management company had done to your property and what it had cost you to fight it. And I thought about the fact that agricultural land adjacent to residential development is going to be farmed. That's what it is." I said, "Yes." He said, "I talked to 4 of my neighbors about it, the ones most affected by the view change. I told them what I knew about the boundary dispute. I told them the management company had made a claim it could not support and had cost us $22,000 in dues to fight it and lose." I said, "How did they respond?" He said, "Variously. 2 of them were angry, 1 was philosophical about it, 1 asked what the current management contract cost annually and when it was up for renewal." I said, "That is a productive question." He said, "Pinnacle's contract comes up in December." I said, "December." He said, "I am on the committee that reviews the contract." I said, "James." He said, "Owen." We drank our coffee in the barn. The cattle were visible through the open equipment bay door, moving slowly through the morning pasture the way cattle do, without urgency, without drama, the steady movement of animals that are where they are supposed to be doing what they are supposed to do. James said, "If the view from my porch is going to be your barn instead of the mountains, I would rather it be a barn that is well maintained and on a farm that is genuinely active." I said, "It will be." He said, "And I would rather be a neighbor to someone who was treated correctly than to be on the side of the people who did the treating." I said, "I appreciate that." He finished his coffee. He shook my hand. He thanked Laura for the tour. He drove back down the lane to Caldwell Ridge Estates and his east-facing porch that now looked at 200 feet of traditional barn red and white trim in morning light. Pinnacle Property Services lost the Caldwell Ridge Estates management contract in December. James Whitmore told me by text, a brief message that said simply, "New management company starts February, 8-3 vote." I said, "Good." He said, "The new company's first meeting agenda item is a review of all pending boundary matters to ensure they are properly documented." I said, "That is a sensible first agenda item." He said, "I suggested it." I said, "James, thank you." He said, "Owen, thank you for the barn tour." The barn held its first full hay inventory in August. 212 tons in the north storage end, floor to nearly the ceiling, the sweet dusty smell of good dry hay that I have always found one of the more satisfying smells on a farm, because it means you have done the summer's work correctly and the winter's feed is accounted for. I stood in the hay storage end on an August evening and looked at what we had put up. Laura was somewhere in the main house. The cattle were in the east pasture. The day's heat was fatting, and the smell of the hay was all around me, and the barn was solid in every dimension. 10 feet of land had turned into this, not because I had planned it that way, because when someone tried to take something that was mine, I had found out what the law actually said, had done what it permitted, and had built something real and lasting and genuinely useful in the process. The western boundary of my property is exactly where it has always been. The survey markers are in the ground, reinstalled by Catherine Morse at Pinnacle's expense, photographed and documented in a file that Robert Calloway maintains in case any future dispute arises. The quiet title judgment is recorded at the county courthouse. The barn permit is filed with the building department. All of it is documented. All of it is permanent. The barn will outlast everyone involved in the dispute that led to its construction. It will stand on the western boundary of my property long after Cynthia Park and Pinnacle Property Services and the Caldwell Ridge Estates HOA Management Contract Renewal Committee have all moved on to other things. It will still be a barn, a big one, red on a farm. An agricultural inevitability.